17 minutes past 9 a.m. and shortly we are going to be joined by Ismail Patel, Chairperson of Friends of Al-Aqsa, as we wrap up the 20th anniversary of Palestine's second Intifada. Brother Ismail, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brother Ismail, Assalamu alaikum. Okay, I think we're having a slight issue trying to get in touch with him, but I'm sure Shazia will get hold of Ismail Patel, and we are talking about the 20th anniversary of the second Intifada. And earlier on, I mentioned briefly this article that has been written by Talal Abu Rahma, and the article is entitled Behind the Lens, Remembering Muhammad al-Durrah 20 years on. And this sent a very, very powerful message right across the entire globe in terms of exposing the brutality of the Israeli security apparatus, its soldiers acting with impunity, shooting indiscriminately. And for many of us who will recall that day and that image, was such a powerful image that when one had actually sat down and looked at it, and you could look at it from various angles. On the one hand, you had the father doing his utmost, trying to shield or to protect his son. And also on the other side, a 12-year-old boy in all his innocence, his short life taken away from him. And this is what this cameraman Talal Abu Rahma portrays in that video clip, but also at the same time when he writes this article. It was an article that sent waves right across the entire world, and he says when he was actually witnessing this incident, he says at 3 to 4 p.m. there was nothing happening. It was a Friday, the West Bank was on fire, but Gaza was really quiet. I know why it was quiet, because the schools were closed and it was the holy day. And he says, we were watching the situation, and I knew as a journalist that on Saturday morning there would be a demonstration in Gaza. And at that time, there were three very sensitive points in Gaza, one in Erez, one north of Gaza City, and third in the middle on Salahuddin Road. And this is where that incident had taken place. I see Brother Ismail Patel is with us. Brother Ismail, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam, and assalamu alaikum to all your listeners.
Jazakallah khairan so much for joining us this morning. Jummah Mubarak to you out in the UK. Now, we have been focusing during the course of the week, giving coverage to the 20th anniversary of the second Palestinian Intifada. And the face of that Intifada was this young boy, Muhammad al-Durrah, where 20 years on, we found that, obviously his martyrdom had sent shockwaves right across the entire world, but also sent a very, very powerful message in terms of exposing the Israel military and the brutality of the Israeli security forces.
Sure. Well, I mean, what we have here is a symbol of Palestinian resistance and suffering in both together. And the fact that the world required that is an indictment on the world population. But really, what we have to take from that is that the Palestinian struggle is still carrying on. People are still aware of it, despite the international governments in support of Israel. And the Palestinians are not forgotten. The fact that Al-Aqsa Intifada took place 20 years ago, and the sustained attack by the Israelis upon the Palestinian people, and the continuing support for the Palestinian people and the presence of the Palestinian peoples speaks volumes.
Yes. Now, obviously, Brother Ismail, I know since that second Intifada 20 years ago, and you obviously have had a lot of opportunity over the years to analyze what that Intifada had actually meant for the people of Palestine. It's subsequently, when one looks at Israel and what Israel has been doing in the last 20 years since that Intifada, and so much has actually happened in the last 20 years.
Well, there's several things we can think about. First is there's a turn in the Palestinian resistance from much more nationalistic to more Islamic oriented. The fact that it was called Al-Aqsa Intifada is a symbol on its own. It also transcends the Arab world to bring in Muslim world overall into the Palestinian conflict. The second, as well, they did not abandon the human rights issue at the same time. So the Muslim dialogue or the discourse that was put forward was more generic, and it challenged the Western narrative. And I think that is something very, very important. And this is what frightens the colonialist, imperialist power around the globe, that here are an oppressed people using their own language and their own terminology for a liberation movement. So I think that's something we should never forget, that what the Palestinians are doing for the rest of the world community, whether Muslims or non-Muslims. But what they're doing is they're standing up against colonialist, imperialist powers. So that's something extremely important for us to understand. The second thing that happened is, of course, the Palestinians between the 1967 area and the 48 area also tried to bring about a bridge, while Israel always tries to divide them and calls the Palestinians in the 48 area as Arabs, Arab Muslims, and the Palestinians in the 67 area. What the Intifada did was to bring these two groups together. So that is something very significant, that the Palestinians come to see themselves as a whole body and not being divided by the occupying power. And of course, the third factor it did is to bring about an international awareness to the Palestinian cause on a much wider scale. I mean, the world had always been aware of the Palestinian issue, but what the Al-Aqsa Intifada did was to bring about a wider momentum. I mean, we had demonstrations right across the globe, I remember, and people in tens of thousands were coming out in European capital city, including England, in London, where we had demonstrations. So there was a great empathy for the Palestinian cause. And this change in dynamics away from what the governing powers wanted the narrative to be, I think is very significant. Despite that, having mentioned all those three things, on the other side, we've had Israel carrying on with its occupation, extending its settlements, extending its apartheid policy within West Bank, annexation of territory, building the wall, and all these other violations, human rights violations against the Palestinian. And this is happening against the will of the people of the world, not only the Palestinian. They're only able to get away because of the superpower of the time. America and its allies in Europe are able to support it. But this is something very dangerous for Israel, because its own standing around the globe is really diminishing. And that is something we can sort of trace back to the Al-Aqsa Intifada.
Well, certainly, and obviously, when one looks at the status of Al-Aqsa in itself, and when one recalls Ariel Sharon together with the soldiers, obviously going into Masjid al-Aqsa, and that obviously triggered off anger right across the entire world, the Muslim world in particular as well. And since then, we've seen Ariel Sharon come and go. But also Al-Aqsa has been under severe pressure since then, because basically what that visit of Ariel Sharon did was basically given Israel and its administration, and also at the same time the security apparatus, an open license to do whatever they wanted to at will, and to act with impunity in Masjid al-Aqsa itself.
Sure. I mean, Ariel Sharon did sort of open the path for the right-wing Zionist extremists to start visiting the Masjid al-Aqsa Haram and also try and claim that it should belong to them and destroy it. And of course, what we have from that 20 years on is now the negotiation that has taken place, or the normalization of relationship between UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, which is also taking a step further in losing or in surrendering Masjid al-Aqsa. But having said that, I mean, you know, this powers to be acting against the will of the people. It'd be interesting to see if UAE members and Bahrainis will be ever able to visit with the welcoming of the Palestinians. That will never happen. But the dangers are there, and the world society needs to be aware of what Israel is capable of doing, considering that what they have done so far in the last 20 years, they have moved very, very slowly, but surely trying to take over Masjid al-Aqsa. And we should be very, very alert and not be complacent of the potential dangers that Israel poses to Masjid al-Aqsa.
Yes, and I think what is important, and I think you've raised a very important point here, Brother Ismail, where we're talking about this normalization of relations with Israel, particularly by countries like Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. And also at the same time, we know that Israel has been supported, whether it's been the Republicans or the Democrats in the United States of America. And with election year in the United States of America, there have been huge question marks regarding Joe Biden in particular, and also in terms of racist remarks and his support for this Zionist state of Israel.
Yeah, unfortunately, we find ourselves in a very dire position in reference to Israel, in particularly considering the U.S. elections. Either way, whether Trump comes in or Biden, unfortunately, the situation for Palestinians will not change. I believe Biden will follow what Trump has been doing. He might do it silently, not using the derogative language or the provocative language that Trump uses. But as far as policies are concerned, they'll mirror each other. He's already mentioned that he will not move the American embassy from Jerusalem. That also means that the normalization process and the American deal that's on the table will carry on, and the plight of the Palestinians will continue under Biden. Having said that, I mean, what American Democrats should do is use this period to pre-election, is try and get some guarantees and concession from Biden. And if they can afford that, then it will be some sort of leverage to be acted upon. But I don't think we should rest our hope on either of them. This now really rests, and unfortunately, to the civil society, the global civil society need to rise up, and it should make the politicians pariah. And this has been done in the past, and I say this over and over again. People outside South Africa, we remember that the world governments supported apartheid South African regime government. But when the public went against it, the leaders could no longer afford to support the government of South Africa. And when you had the release of Nelson Mandela. So this is what we need to do. Everybody around the globe has a responsibility to rise up, make noise, campaign and lobby against what's happening to the Palestinians.
Finally, how should the Muslim world be reacting to the likes of the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain in normalizing relationship with Israel?
Routes we can take, and individual has to make his own decision at the moment. But I think we should think about boycotting. We should also think about calling them out. And I think it's time to realize that the political axes that are emerging are not based on faith. They're based on ideology. And our ideology should be for justice, peace, and harmony. And those who believe in those ideologies, and that is principles of Islam, justice is central principle of Islam, then we should speak up against those who are unjust. And I believe UAE and Bahrain are unjust against an oppressed people, and therefore we should speak up against them. And I think this is a great responsibility that the Muslim world is silent about it. And I think we are not doing justice to ourselves, to our faith, and to the Palestinian people.
Well, Brother Ismail, Jazakallah so much for that and for your time with us as always here on Salam Media. We wish you all the best. Allah accept your efforts. And I know you've been a stalwart, and obviously your untiring efforts, obviously working. And we lost, in fact, somebody in South Africa, and I'm not too sure whether you have met him. We had a Dr. Anwar Nagya, and, sadly, we lost a legend, who was so passionate about the Palestinian cause in South Africa.
I meet him and we make du'as for him, and we make dua for him. Inshallah, Allah raise his ranks and give him Jannat al-Firdaus.
Ameen, ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum.
That was Ismail Patel joining us this morning on Salam Media, and 20 years on looking at the Intifada and wrapping it up for this week. We've had a few discussions looking at various angles, and once again, this whole question surrounding the American elections. And I think also to a large extent, the normalization of relations between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, that is not going to go away. And this has been a major concern from across the entire Muslim world. We come back, we'll be joined by Nurjan Ali, co-founder of Women of Waqf. They've got